Well, I'm really delighted to welcome Professor Nancy Ries to food class today. Thank you so much for joining us. Professor Ries is my colleague, beloved colleague in the sociology and anthropology department, and she's an anthropologist. As you can gather from the article, she studies Russia. And I have a few questions I'm hoping to ask you today that were developed by some of the students in our class that is about your article, Potato Ontology. And the first question is basically just to kind of understand a little bit how in your career of researching Russia, you got interested in potatoes. You know, you've written a number of different things about Russia. And at some point, potatoes seemed interesting, significant to you. Can you just tell us a little bit about kind of how you got interested in potatoes and decided to write this article?
Sure, Professor Henke. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to talk to your class. It's always super fun to engage with your students and with you. So I really appreciate this opportunity. Um, so I never ever planned to study potato. I had been doing research in Russia since the mid 1980s, and my really intensive period of research was in 1988 and 89, 90 when I did my dissertation research. And I was then studying the Cold War from a Soviet-Russian perspective. But the Soviet Union was falling apart, and nobody really wanted to talk about the Cold War. They wanted to talk about how their world was falling apart. And one of the things that even in 1989, 90 really struck me was the ways that families had, and especially older people. I always interviewed a lot of older people, and there are reasons for that. But um, the ways that people had of surviving in a situation where they couldn't count on the food stores having a steady supply of their normal foodstuffs, where they couldn't really rely on having very much money to spend to buy food, even if the stores did have food. So even from 89, 90, when I was doing my first real big research stint, I was interested in the question of both the actual material survival strategies that people had, but also the ways in which survival is always in any culture, both a material and a set of cultural tools. So when I went back in the towards the late 1990s, I had been doing a lot of research in the 90s on a bunch of different things, but I was really interested in the question of everyday survival practices. The economic situation got worse and worse and worse as the 90s went on, and regular people, teachers, college professors, doctors, nurses, government workers, workers of all kinds in more of the what we would here call blue collar workforce, the factory workers, et cetera, were really getting by on profoundly little money and irregular salary payments. And I was just interested in how they survived. And it just happened, like this is one of those ethnographic, anthropological, or broader social science techniques and skills and habits that you learn, is to listen to what people say.
Mm.
And so I learned to have good ears, anthropological ears. And over, people just said, when I would say, so, how do you survive? How are you getting by? How is your family coping? They would say, they would look at me and pause, and they would laugh a little bit, and they would say, "Kartoshka, мы живем на картошке, we live on potato." And finally, I started realizing there's something there. And so I started asking people about potato. And once I started actually asking people directly about potato, this whole thing just opened up. It was amazing. And I realized there was something in potato that captured way more than potato, as I think my article makes clear, but that potato was a great vehicle for kind of riding through culture and society and material practice.
Awesome. I think that actually really nicely leads into the next question where I wanted to ask about the title of your article, Potato Ontology. And I'm assuming that if I ask you the question, how is it that you decided to choose that word ontology? I guess we maybe want to, maybe if you could give us a nutshell definition of what you think ontology means, but then also like, why did you think that that was a concept that really helped capture for you this all-encompassing way that potato helped describe kind of a cultural and material response to scarcity and hardship?
So I love that question. Why ontology? In a sense, when you put the word potato, kartoshka, when you put the word potato
You've got some
next,
potatoes for
I've
us.
got some potatoes for you. I'm happy to play with potatoes in our interview. When you put something this banal and this funny, potato makes people laugh across cultures. I don't know why. A funny kind of thing. And I know you grow food and you grow potatoes, so you have some, you have some direct experience. This is a funny, humorous, kind of lovable object. And I can talk about why that's the case. When you put that potato next to ontology, there's a kind of poetic frisson that happens. It's a
Mhm.
kind of contradiction. But for me, that I did that once when I was giving a talk, one of the first talks I gave actually about this project at Colgate. I gave a brown bag, and I put these words together for the first time because the Greek word, so I studied Greek in college. I studied classical Greek. So I kind of understand how root words work. So in Greek, ontos is simply the word, the word to be, or the category of words around the verb to be, being in the world, isness, if you don't mind a little bit of kind of philosophical way of thinking, isness. And for me, that really worked to get at the way in which potato in Russia, it's not just about practice, like growing potatoes and cooking potatoes. It's not just about language or narrative. It's not just about political, social, economic structures and institutions that of the kind I describe in the paper of the potato institutes. It's not just about whole, historical practices and institutions that provide potato for people. Um, it's about all of those things, and it's about the ways that they intersect.
Mhm.
And it's especially about what I noticed when I actually directly asked people to talk to me about potato. It's about how potato stories opened up stories about the war, stories about family, stories about digging in the dirt, stories about fear and hope and self-reliance, and that those ended up being stories at the heart about selfhood.
Mm.
And selfhood as a kind of cultural thing, cultural selfhood, culturally inflected selfhood, is about isness, is about being in the world. It's about being at the deepest level. And what I realized and it still happens to this day when I talk to people about potato, which I sometimes do in Russia, it opens up something at the heart of personal being, family being, poetic being, historical being, emotional being, and political social being. And so it's a device that links all of those things in this kind of, so that this
Mhm.
thing that's this kind of dorky object ends up being this amazing poetic device that goes to the heart of being. Ontology.
Mhm. Great. That's a really good definition and explanation, I think, of how potato connects to ontology. And I really love the way you describe that kind of contrast between the humble potato and the fancy $5 word ontology. So
It- it's
there's a
exactly
couple
that. Yeah.
there's a couple of episodes in your article that students were really interested in. I wanted to ask you about a couple of them. One of them was this discussion about the Colorado beetle. Obviously, Colorado is a state in the US. And there was this sense by some of your Russian friends and colleagues that maybe the US had sent the Colorado beetle as almost like a weapon against them in their fields to make their lives miserable and to ruin their crops and stuff like that. And we're just kind of wondering a little bit more about the connection across the world of this beetle and how that maybe impacted people's survival practices, the way that they thought about potatoes in their lives, and to what extent the US was at all implicated in any way in introducing it
Yeah.
there.
Well, okay, so the Colorado beetle, and I actually should have looked this up. What is the Latin for this particular beetle? The Colorado beetle, and I know you know what these are. These
Mhm.
are green and orange striped, very shiny, like almost luminescent beetles that eat the leaves of many different plants, including potato plants. And they will, once you have an infestation of these beetles, and you know what I'm talking about, these
Mhm.
little
They're really
luminescent,
distinctive. They look like a jewel almost.
yes, like they're jewel-like. Once you have an infestation of these, you can have a beautiful plant when you go to bed, and you come out the next morning and it's completely defoliated. And gardeners use all kinds of techniques. Oh, my phone is ringing. Wait, sorry.
It's okay.
Got to turn off my phone. Gardeners use all kinds of techniques like cups of beer to attract them and drown them, and lots of pesticides. But Russians don't like using chemical pesticides. So they also use beer and other means of getting, or they just pick these beetles off. And in Russian, they're called Koloradsky zhuk. I have found that's just the name of them. They're called
Koloradsky
Koloradsky.
juk.
I have no idea whether they're called Colorado beetles in the US. I don't think so. This is
Okay.
just the slang term, and who knows how that entered in. I was never able to figure out where that, like at
Mm.
what point did that start to be the name that people call these beetles? And they call them this in Ukraine, in Belarus, in Poland. So at some point in murky history, this particular beetle got this particular name. I think it's just, and it may be an invasive species from North America. Um, People usually laugh about it when they say, so this is the sphere of rumor and joke and and sort of gardening lore that's passed on. I don't actually think that most people believe that it was a bioweapon. I
Mhm.
think people think it's, probably know it's an invasive species that is hard to eradicate once it settles in.
I see.
So it's really just kind of but it is widely called Koloradsky zhuk. And if you say Koloradsky zhuk, people will draw a picture for you of this particular beetle.
Uh-huh. And roll their eyes about how much of a pest and trouble it is, basically.
Yeah, and they'll give you 20 different ways of eradicating it. Just as here when you work in
Okay,
the garden.
good. So we have a little detective work to do maybe to see like where it originated from and how it got there maybe. Another one that students found interesting was when you talked about this article in a magazine that was called Russia or something like that, I think.
Russia, uh-huh.
Yeah, and it was about the happiness of peeling potatoes. And there's a quotation that you take from that. It's talking about kind of how a woman should engage with her husband and make him feel welcome as well as kind of useful. And there's this quote that says, "Try to help her with." Oh no, sorry, it's instructions for husbands.
Right.
Try to help her with work in the kitchen and show that you like peeling potatoes in her company. That will fill your woman's heart with joy. And so obviously there's kind of a gendering there of the work and the roles that are associated with potatoes. And we kind of want to know a little bit more about that gender structure around the work it takes to process, consume potatoes, and to what extent that reflects kind of maybe larger Russian politics around gender roles.
So that's a great question. There is a ton ton of wonderful social science literature in both English and Russian about Russian gender roles. And I've written about this in a few places and almost in practically everything I've ever published, because gender, of course, structures a lot of things.
Mhm.
Um, to the frustration of a typical 60s and 70s raised American feminist, the Russian culture has very sort of very hardened gender ideologies, and the the vast majority of people to this day still believe that men and women are by nature certain ways, and that because our nature is to do this and not that, we should, it's natural for us to follow certain kinds of domestic divisions of labor.
Mhm.
um, so people in Russia talk about these divisions of labor a lot. Women cook and men work on the car. So one of my best friends, often I'll see them in the kitchen, and these are very educated, very liberated people in many, many ways. But I'll see them in the kitchen and he's got the carburetor and they live in a small apartment. He's got the carburetor on the kitchen table and he's using a toothbrush to clean out the carburetor of his old car, where you can still take the carburetor out of the car. And she's cleaning, she's chopping vegetables. And that, like, to me signals this division of labor. So the only practice that men often engage in the kitchen is cleaning potatoes. And so this funny object is interestingly has a kind of odd gender identity, because you pull it from the dirt. Men do work in the garden, although they tend to do the heavier work and the dirtier work, whereas
Mhm.
women are the ones who go through and pick the dead flowers off of plants, right? So women tend to do the lighter work, the gentler work, the cleaner work, and men often do the dirty work, the heavy work, the work that touches the soil. So because potato is a soil touching vegetable, it's really normal for men. Now, they wouldn't use this fancy kind of OXO tool. They would just use a knife, as I discuss
Yeah, that's right.
in the
Waste too
paper.
much potato, right?
Waste too much of the peel. But it's really common for men to take a big bucket and put it on a newspaper on the kitchen floor and spend an hour cleaning a whole bunch of potatoes. And then the women will take the clean potatoes, cut them up, and fry them. But interestingly, in many American families with male female parents, you'll notice that it is, even in the United States, men often cook potatoes but don't make salad.
Mhm.
So think about your own families and how, even with feminist households, men and women do slightly different labor in many kitchens. Now, that
Mhm.
doesn't hold true for all kitchens, but there's this weird sense that objects are gendered and that
Mhm.
the practices connected to certain objects are gendered. Russian families are still very gender divided in many, many ways.
Mhm. In that kind of traditional sense that we would think of, the
Yes.
classic kind of male-female division of family labor.
And they believe it's kind of hardwired, genetic. And so when you talk to people in Russia, for instance, about LGBTQ rights, it doesn't have a lot of traction in Russia. Uh, and especially not when you have a president like Putin, who is very much against LGBTQ
Mm.
families.
Mhm.
So, there's a lot of interesting kind of gender traditionalism there, which,
Mhm.
it's sort of hard sometimes when you're a feminist scholar working there. But it's also really interesting.
Great, thank you. This is kind of a question that goes back to the beginning of the interview where we were discussing how you got interested in potato. And if you think about kind of where we're at as a globe right now, the pandemic obviously is a big issue. People are talking about climate change. I know you're teaching a course about the Anthropocene. this semester as an FSEM. So a lot of people are kind of like talking about what's the world coming to?
Mhm.
And one question the students had was, to what extent is this Russian potato set of practices, especially kind of like the small family dacha, kind of a model of sustainable production that maybe is a little bit more shockproof to some of the things that
Mhm.
we're experiencing in the world right now? Like, should we be looking at Russian potato as a model for how to be a little bit more sustainable?
Uh, I think absolutely yes. Um, what I see in Russia, and I haven't been there, of course, since the pandemic. People kind of know how to cope with absolutely world-shattering changes in the political economy and in the social fabric. Um, so they know how to, they have dealt with obviously with World War II and the Nazi German army invading the Soviet Union and killing millions of people and sending the whole population into starvation for the years of the war, but then the years after the war were incredibly hard years. Perestroika brought another period of hardship, and people just kind of kept their dachas going throughout all of these terrible, terrible periods. They know how to they know how to feed themselves. Many people, a lot of people have lost these habits, but if their grandparents are still alive, they often, in especially the more rural parts of Russia, people still survive in very small holdings.
Mhm.
This is not a survival that most people in Europe or America, Western Europe or North America would find at all easy. It's not. Um, but I think that combined with the fact that that they are very suspicious of pesticides and chemical herbicides, pesticides and chemical fertilizers, they use what you use. They use compost.
Mhm.
That is not a sort of contemporary cool thing. That is just like, of course you use compost, right?
Mhm.
So they have many ways of sustaining themselves in small holdings for long periods of time. And I don't want to romanticize that entirely because it also can signify real hardship. But I think and I'm really interested in the kind of the return of things like gardening for pollinators, gardening to reduce lawn and increase rewilding kinds of things. The Russian dacha garden, the traditional Russian dacha garden doesn't really need to rewild because it never left
Mhm.
the planting indigenous plants and hoping the Colorado beetle doesn't come and eat them. Planting indigenous plants and surviving on indigenous plants. Of course, potatoes are North American, or
South American.
are South American, are from the Americas. Tobacco is from the Americas. These are all New World things. Tomatoes, which Russians love tomatoes. These are also New World, North and
Mhm.
South American products. So, the world is a really complicated place when you talk about species transmission. But people do know how to live on, they also know how to live without going to the store very often, without consuming plastics. They kind of, older, more traditional families kind of hate plastic things
Mm.
and find our reliance on buying, shopping constantly a little bit silly.
Mm.
Though there is a bourgeois class that got rich after perestroika, after the end of the Soviet Union, and consumes thoughtlessly the way many of us also do.
Mhm.
So that
Great.
was a long-winded answer to a short question.
No, I think, yeah, I mean, you said yes, basically.
I said yes, yes.
Somewhat qualified yes, but overall yes, I think, yeah. So last question is just, we're curious about to what extent you think the things that you report on in the article are more or less the same today in Russia, or would you say that there's any kind of relatively major changes to any part of the story that you tell?
So that's a great question. the wealthy, more Europe-focused parts of Russia, so that is Moscow and St. Petersburg, basically, two mega cities, are very, are very sophisticated bourgeois. The shopping centers exploded after perestroika, and people in those cities have a little bit lost their some of their tendency to grow vegetables in their gardens.
Mhm.
But every other Russian city still maintains this kind of ring around the cities that expands outward from the cities, where people go to their dachas and grow vegetables. And the further out you get from cities, people are still very reliant on their own produce. So and they're also just very culturally dedicated to those summer practices of going out. Either they live in places where they can grow vegetables right there, or they go a little distance from their apartments and have these, what we would see these things and see them as shacks. They look, to North American eyes, they look like shacks, but they're they're very lively shacks, where a huge amount of activity takes place in the nice months, which is kind of like Hamilton, New York. It's 5 or 6 months where you can be outside growing things.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you again so much for your time. We really appreciate it. And I know that the students are going to be really interested to pair up the reading in our discussion in class with the Q&A that you've done with us here. So thanks.
Great. Well, it's always a pleasure to talk to you and to be able to talk to your students. So thanks very much. And if you have any follow-up questions, you know to find me on email and Zoom.
Thanks a lot. Take care.
Thanks. Great. Have a good discussion. Bye.
Thank you. So I just